I do wonder about someone's asking about John Brown, and they said, why can't more people be like John Brown? I don't think John Brown was a maniac. I do not think that he was insane. I think that's Dunning School propaganda. I think that he was certainly a fanatic, but a fanatic for the right cause is one of the most noble people that we can conceive of, and one of the most necessary for any justice to ever occur. But he was also wildly and stridently religiously pious. He was a deeply, deeply religious person in a way that they don't really make anymore. All these fucking Christians in this country don't really believe in God. They have completely de-spiritualized Christianity. That's why American Protestantism isn't Christianity at all, because at a certain point it becomes the attempt to create heaven on earth becomes literal, and you are now just trying to experience the pleasures of eternity on this plane. It's pure. It's disgusting. But so even those people, the people who call themselves very religious and go to church all the time, they don't really believe. They don't have like the fire of God within them. Certainly not enough to do a thing like go to a fucking armory and steal a bunch of guns and try to go to war with the entire United States government to end slavery. Which if every white person in the North who didn't want slavery had done, they might have actually accomplished it. Because so few are touched with that sort of holy fire. And, it doesn't have to be Christian, obviously, but there has to be some sort of belief system, some sort of transcendent belief system undergirding your convictions for it to be ever possible for your performance of those beliefs to have full force behind them, the way a guy like John Brown had. Full commitment. And maybe his commitment is scary, and it is. But it's because his faith is scary to us, because it's not something we recognize. It's not a way of seeing and feeling and thinking that we can see ourselves in. And you can say, no, I want what's good for other people for purely material reasons, whatever. And sure, we're all working towards some sort of through a material understanding of the world, a material understanding of what makes human happiness and all that stuff. But if there isn't something else behind it, I just don't know how much you're ever going to be willing to sacrifice for that belief. Because you're doing it for yourself at the end of the day. You're doing it so that you can live in a world that has certain characteristics in it. And the idea of sacrificing yourself so others could achieve it, that requires a certain perspective, I guess, that is harder and harder to come by, the degree to which you are tethered to life and material existence as like the sum total of life. And I don't know what that means. I'm just thinking out loud here, but when people talk about John Brown, that's the main difference that strikes me. And the thing is that somebody says you need martyrs. I don't think that would work either. Like somebody says the guy, John Brown helped cause the Civil War. There's no question about that. I think it was Frederick Douglass who pointed out, anybody who says John Brown failed at Harper's Ferry looks to the fact that a year after he was executed, within a year of the execution of John Brown, or 2 years, the guy who sentenced him to death in the military court was in American custody and charged with treason because he'd been captured on a Confederate boat trying to get to England to negotiate the recognition of the Confederacy, as it's called the Trent Affair. He was in American custody. He was in an American dungeon. So 2 years of John Brown's execution. It's hard to imagine it happening without that crucible event and that sharpening of the distinction and sharpening of the stakes at play. We've had people like that now in this moment. There's the guy who tried to attack that ice facility, right? They got shot. There's the guy. There have been a number of people who've set themselves on fire. A couple of Uber drivers here in New York, at least a couple here. There's a guy who set himself on fire at Prospect Park to protest global warming. But the thing is because there is nothing behind any action. There's no movement behind it. There's no greater understanding being represented by it that is understood by all sides. It can't have any real power. The reason that that Harper's Ferry struck such a thunderbolt in the South was because of how many Northerners they knew agreed with John Brown. How many Northerners had sympathy for John Brown? All throughout the North, but especially in New England, church bells rang in commemoration of him after he was executed. A guy who was sentenced to death for treason and who had fired on American troops. And they knew that the stakes were real and that they needed to break off from the United States as quickly as possible so that they could prevent the slow and steady usurpation of slavery by those people, which they knew was inevitable now. Whereas any action taken now is not taken on behalf of any constituency that has any form that anyone recognizes. So I wanted to read something from a book I just started, which is Russell Banks's Cloudsplitter, which is an epistolary novel of letters ostensibly from Owen Brown, the last surviving son of John Brown, from years after Harper's Ferry, recounting the experiences of living with John Brown. And I just started it, and it's very good so far. But I wanted to read something from it that hits on one of the, like I've talked about John Brown here and how he is like the model of sacrifice out of love, of conviction, out of belief, out of faith, and how it's hard for us to look at that and make it coherent because we don't live that way, because we have been materialized. We are sort of ego bound in a way that makes us unwilling to risk comfort. And it's not, like I said, it's not our fault. We have to fight against it. And one of the things that flows from, like, a lot of people will point out to John Brown, like, oh, he was a religious fanatic. Like, if he was around now, he'd like be shooting up abortion clinics, or he'd be like a MAGA psycho because he's so pissed about like pink-haired transgendered people going to the wrong bathroom or something because it's against the Bible. And I think that confuses how religion works within someone, because the people who are that way, the people who are psychotically fixated on like enforcing a explicitly religious social demand, do so out of lack of belief, out of lack of faith. They have no belief, and that's why they're tempted. That's why they have to seek it out and suppress it, not for their children, because they're their children, you know. You should be instilling values, and part of it is because their lives are harder and more alienated, and they have less time to spend instilling values in their children, and that does give them anxiety. But a lot of it is they're tempted themselves. I mean, we know the amount of porn consumed in the Bible Belt. Utah, for example, I think was one of the highest internet porn consumption in the country. But that speaks to the fact that there is a real temptation. And that's because of a lack of real conviction in not that God exists. They think God exists, but like God is a separate being, heaven as a real place, their soul as eternal and never to be brought back into communion with God, really. If so, at far, far distant future. So they believe in that, but that's just an external mechanism of enforcement of behavior, because they don't have, their ego is completely fixed on self-indulgence. And so they want to do all the bad things. They want to do all the bad things, and
only God in their head will stop them. And if culture gets more tempting, that will tempt them too. It's the logic of the Al Qaeda like Al Qaeda and ISIS guys. Like all the Belgian gamer kids who went to ISIS to cut heads off. It wasn't just the promise of slave girls and stuff or going to heaven. It was because they believed in God like as an architecture of like an enforcement of behavior, and they believed in like the mythology of it and where their soul would end up. But they did not believe it out of a desire to transcend the self through communion with others, because they grew up in fucking alienated anhedonic Western Europe, and it's like that's why so many of them were like fail-son gamers or drug dealers, criminals, and like why not some of the 9/11 hijackers went to a strip club like that before they did 9/11. That wasn't hypocrisy. It didn't mean they didn't believe in their faith as an abstract concept. What it meant is that they were tempted by all of the West, and they would rather annihilate themselves in an act of purity than risk continuing their life and being tempted, which is what the West would continue to do. And that's because people want to say that's Islam. No, that's not Islam. That is the fact that this is the way different cultures at different levels of symbolic like reasoning and symbolic logic and like axis of like symbolic attachment respond to the destabilizing and atomizing effects of capitalism as they undermine social connections. How do people respond to that? And that like you make these people who have in their head an ancient religious tradition that sprang out of originally a desire to dissolve distinctions and become reunited with all other people and then with God, which is all other people in the universe. And have over time been replaced by this psychic regime of coercion, because the lives we live have drained that of us. It's drained out of us, and so we're fallen. That's the actual sin. That's the actual fallenness. But because we don't even recognize that's the source of it, we decide, oh, I just have to not do the bad things and stop the temptation to do the bad things, and that will make me good. No, you'll still be separated. You will still go to hell when you die, and that you will die in fear, because you will die gone mad at the prospect of losing attachment to the world. Attachment to the world that is totally organized around you perceiving yourself as the sole node of consciousness in the universe. And John Brown was different than so many men of his generation, and so many religious men of his generation. Because remember, there were plenty of pro-slavery Christians. I mean, the fucking Southern Baptists broke away from the Methodists because they were being too persnickety about owning people, and built a whole new ideology. I mean, the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa was like arranged around like reifying hierarchy. Why? Because it was really a project of indulgence. It was a project of extracting surplus. We're going to get the diamonds. We're going to get the land. But John Brown didn't want to do it. John Brown saw the humanity because he felt connected to all humans. He felt the connection to black people the same, because it was not obfuscated by this craving for satisfaction in the material world that comes from ego separation. He didn't have that, and so he could see clearly, and then act morally, which is what we can't do. And I'm not saying it's impossible, but it is an individual struggle within all of us to eventually rediscover the ability to do that. But he was there. He was like he was a rare. Like the system is not set to create people like him, even by the 1830s, but certainly not in America. But the right things popped together. He was in the right places at the right times, had the right grooves in his brain to create, to actually see the world as it existed. To put on he created his own They Live glasses. And I think in this section, there's early in the book, Owen Brown is describing John Brown as a father, and reading it really hit me just how what he's describing, whether it was true or not, like I think, obviously this is a novel, but I think that this description comports to how I imagine faith works in one who really believes. Let me find it here. All right, here we go. Following yesterday's letter, I've been recalling this morning those early days in New Richmond and the peaceful prior years of my boyhood in Hudson, both wildernesses of the old Western Reserve when we resided there, as fraught with difficulty and danger on our first arrival in settlement as was our Adirondack Mountain farm later. We lived in our villages then amongst wolves and bears and mountain lions in deep forests that blocked out all light in the lost ravines. We lived close to Indians, Iroquois mostly, suspicious and withdrawn and silent, who sometimes left their forest enclaves and visited our villages to trade, but mainly kept a safe distance from us. And there was the occasional fugitive slave coming up from Kentucky or the mountains of western Virginia by way of the Underground Railroad, run generally by the Quakers back then, and passing through to Canada, a quiet, frightened, day-long visitor hidden in the attic of our house and spirited on under hay and father's wagon as soon as night fell to the farm of a Quaker or some fellow radical abolitionist 30 or 40 miles to the north. But recalling those days of long ago, after having seen all of the civilized world that an ordinary man needs to see in order to know the true nature of people and society, I am struck by nothing so much as our sustained virtue and orderliness. Wherever we lived in those days, wherever we set up our house and farm and commenced doing business with our neighbors, we were like an island in a sea of chicanery, godlessness, disorder, and willful ignorance. For we Browns were distinct. We were different from most of those who surrounded us. We were surrounded not just by wilderness, but by reckless sinners. As individuals and as a family, we were sinners too, of course, like all men and women, but ours was the fastidious sin of pride, for we were proud of our difference and took pleasure in enumerating the ways in which it got daily manifested. We even prided ourselves on the number of occasions and the ways in which our friends and neighbors were affronted by our virtue and orderliness, or found it strange or eccentric, and as a result held themselves off from us, choosing to view us, as did the Iroquois, from what must have felt to them a safe distance. Our pride, that subtlest and most insidious of sins, got manifested in a variety of ways. But, all reports to the contrary, I do not believe that we were arrogant. Certainly Mother, and later my stepmother Mary, and my sister Ruth were not arrogant, and the younger children were all naturally modest and shy, boys and girls alike, and were constantly encouraged to remain so when they ventured out into the wider world that home provided, and for the most part they did. My older brothers and I, too, strove not to lord it over others less fortunate than we, less disciplined, less inclined to sacrifice their force and time on earth for the greater good, what Father called the common weal. And even Father himself was not arrogant, although he was indeed commanding and headstrong, and made only those demands of us that he made of himself as well, and made no demands on others, but wholly accepted people as he found them. To Father, other people chose to live our way, and there were a few here and there who did, or they choose not to. It was the same to him either way. On the other hand, though, there was never a man so detached from the sinner who so loathed sin when it came to the sin of owning slaves, which Father labeled not sin, but evil. All his loathing came down at once and in a very personal way upon the head of the evildoer. He brooked no fine distinctions. The man who pleaded for the kindly treatment of human chattel, or, as it could occur naturally, like a shift in the seasons, argued for the gradual elimination of slavery was just as evil as the man who whipped, branded, raped, and slew his slaves. And he who did not loudly oppose the extension of slavery into the Western territories was as despicable as he who hounded escaped slaves all the way to Canada and branded them on the spot to punish them and to make pursuit and capture easier next time. But with the notable exception of where a man or woman stood on the question of slavery, when Father considered the difference between our way of life and the ways of others, he did not judge them or lord it over them. He did not condemn or set himself off from our neighbors. He merely observed their ways and passed silently by. And he knew all the ways of men and women extremely well. He was no naif, no bumpkin. My father was not the sort of man who stopped up his ears at the sound of foul language, or shut his eyes to the lasciviousness and sensuality that passed daily before him. He never warned another man or woman off from speech or act because he was too delicate of sensibility, or too pious, or too virtuous to hear of it, or to witness the thing. He knew what went on between men and women, between men and men, between men and animals even, in the small crowded cabins of the settlements and out in the sheds and barns of our neighbors, and he knew what was nightly bought and sold on the streets and alleys and in the taverns of the towns and cities he visited. The man had read every word of his Bible hundreds of times. Nothing human beings did with or to another or themselves shocked him. Only slavery shocked him. Father was a countryman, after all. A farmer and stockman much admired by other farmers and stockmen, a working man who could roll up his sleeves and cut timber, tan hides, or build a stone wall along the side the roughest men in the region. And although he was a failure at it, he was a businessman too, a man who traveled widely to Boston and New York, and once even to England and to the European continent, and stayed in hotels and taverns where prostitutes plied their trade in the lobbies and drinking rooms below, and visited men who traveled with in their rooms next to his, only with a thin partition between. Father knew the ways of most men and women, and he did not loudly condemn them. He merely elected to behave differently, to go his own way, to keep himself pure, and to marry young. Our virtues as a family were, of course, guided and enforced by our earliest childhood years well into adult life by Father's own example and by his steadfast instruction. Although when we did become adults after about age of 16 or so, his manner of dealing with our lapses changed, in that he no longer chastised us or enforced his will and the wisdom of his ways with the rod and belt, or punished us for our disobedience. Instead, he merely withdrew from the offender the shining light of his trust, and no punishment was so powerful a corrective as that. He did not require that we share with him his deep, unquestioning Christian faith, as long as our every act was a reflection of our belief in the rightness of the golden rule and our love of the truth. If you cannot be a believing Christian, but will nonetheless do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and if you will obey the first commandment of Jesus Christ and only substitute the word truth for God, then I swear that I shall not disown you. That was his pledge to us. And it is only that purity of intent and confidence, i.e. faith, real faith, in the interconnectivity of all, not in some fucking fantasy bullshit about lakes of fire and streets of gold. The interconnectivity, the inherent connection of all humans. Only if you start from that premise will you be secure in your beliefs. Otherwise, you will have to always strike down temptation where you see it. And you will be pulled off the beam of reality and pulled towards reactionary attitudes. Because there were a lot of Christians who thought themselves as godly as John Brown at that time, and who believed in God as strongly, and spent all their time complaining about like the demon corn liquor and women showing their ankles, like Boston Corbett cutting his balls off because he got talked to by a prostitute in New York. He wasn't doing that because he could see in front of him. He wasn't trying to ward off doubt.
So, guys, I'm about halfway through Cloudsplitter here, which I read from the other day. The Russell Banks book. That's an epistolary novel. It's the recollections of Owen Brown, the one surviving son of John Brown, who escaped from Harper's Ferry and was not hanged. And I have to recommend it a great deal because not only is it very well written and it's very, evocative of the time and place, it could not be more relevant to what we've been talking about on the stream, because I've talked about how alien John Brown is to us, how his way of seeing the world is one that we cannot replicate if we tried. We could not imbue the world with the moral certainty that he did. We could not imbue it with the spiritual depth that he did. And so it's hard for us to understand him as a person. And the premise of this book, and it operates, I think, from the premise that, hey, Owen Brown ran away. He didn't go to the gallows willingly like his father did. Because there was a point during Harper's Ferry when they could have escaped, when they could have gone back across the border, and they chose not to. John Brown said, no, this is it, we're making the stand. And Owen Brown later escaped. Taking that as like the basic idea, it operates from the perspective of a character who is a modern character. Like Owen Brown, the whole premise of the book really is Owen Brown trying to live in the shadow of and in the influence of and in the direct, like, awestruck countenance of this biblical figure, while being a modern, desacralized, secular being, an uncertain man. The man for whom the post God is dead Nietzsche character, the man, the rope in the abyss. And it's about how someone like that operates in the orbit of a pre-modern figure like Brown, whose spiritual sense is so deeply felt. Because this character, Owen Brown, he has the same beliefs as John Brown about slavery, right? He is totally absorbed in his father's worldview about the necessity to destroy slavery and the equality of blacks with whites. But what he doesn't have is the religious faith that undergirded it. And that's essentially the role of all of us, or a large percentage of us, is that we have these things we know are true, and these horrors, these moral horrors that are before us. But we do not fire them with a religious conviction. There's no flames under the pot to get the fucking steam going through the engine. And this book is about how this guy, Owen Brown, essentially like talks himself into being this figure, pursuing the same course and carrying out the same radical action as his father without the religious conviction, talking himself into it as a postmodern really subject, because the book is written obviously in the 20th century, late 20th century. It's called Cloudsplitter because that's the name of a mountain in the Adirondacks that faced the property that they lived in the 1850s, when Brown went to supervise a freed slave farming community that Garrett Smith, a very well-known and very rich abolitionist, had set up in the Adirondacks. But Cloudsplitter for me is a perfect name too. I always wondered why. I've owned this book for years and moved around the country and never opened it, and I'm finally reading it. I was kind of wondered, it's like, that's kind of an odd title, and now that I know what it means, I get it, because that's the figure of Brown. Brown is the gun splitting the clouds of self-aware uncertainty, the cloud of unbelief, the cloud of, and what I'm realizing reading this is like, obviously that is usually understood as like a lack of religious belief, like in a supernatural or in God, but I think it's more a lack of belief in a lack of belief in there being something outside of us, that, and John Brown felt that as God, as like as the biblical God, but so did many people who loved slavery and said it was a positive good, who could ignore the reality in front of them. But that's because God was this false conception, this mammon figure, like a disguised pagan god that they could confuse with Jehovah. But Brown worshipped the real God, which was universal oneness, which was the in his bones understanding that everyone was of the same material, meaning that there is one soul and that soul is God's. That might not have been how he thought of it. He thought of it in terms of the Bible, but that's how he felt it. That's how he felt his beliefs. And the problem for people like Owen Brown and for us is that we can have those beliefs. We can have an intellectual understanding of the interconnectedness of all, like Bernie liked to say. We are all in this together. We can know why that's true from the perspective of utilitarianism or just good old-fashioned like logic. It makes the most sense for us to cooperate instead of compete because it's more efficient. But we don't have a deeper sense that the other is us. We don't have that sense of immanence, of unity, which Brown called God, but which we could call anything. But what we have to call it something. And it's the lack of that makes us all Owen Browns. And it's very clear in the book that if Owen Brown had not had his father, he would have been lost. Even as much as he chafed at being under his father's bridle and spit the bit that was placed in his mouth and couldn't accept the religious, and often would, at the end he went where his father went and he did what his father did. because he knew the greater rightness of him, because of how it emanated from his father, how he embodied virtue in such a complete way that it meant that his aims had to be virtuous. But once again, that's convincing yourself. It's not believing from your own sense. It's not feeling for yourself. It's thinking your way there. And that's what we're all doing, is trying to think our way there. And we have to keep thinking our way there, but we have to add the fire. We have to get a fire going to get the smoke moving through the machine. And I don't think it's going to be conventional religion. It's not going to be the old-time religion John Brown preached. It's going to be something else. It's going to be syncretic of the current culture, and it's going to be universal, because it has to be, because universality is its essential recognition.
An inebriated past on John Brown. Not a terrible idea. After I finish Cloudsplitter. After I finish Cloudsplitter, I might do that, because John Brown's life is fascinating. Harper's Ferry is just one part of it. He had a really interesting intersection with a lot of elements of America, and he was part of a dynamic between a broadly spoken proletariat, a broadly spoken repressed second-class citizen internal minority in the form of African Americans, both slave and free, and then a northern emerging bourgeois, a middle class with a middle class morality centering in their politics. Those three things orbited each other again, and then of course all of those working, resolving around the grand antagonist of the unified Southern slave power. Like those things interacting with each other, like that was the mortar and pestle of the antebellum era. And John Brown is the straw that stirs the drink. So I think it'd be very profitable to talk about him, not just about how he represents sort of the ideal American in the sense that the one who the best promise of the American experiment could produce. And so rarely did, because it mostly was a failure of an experiment. But the best of what it produced was John Brown. But then also his role in things like Bleeding Kansas, and his role as like the leading edge of anti-slavery opinion, like his willingness to take a leap of faith to go beyond where anyone else was, even at the risk of their own annihilation. That's the engine of history. Like, you need someone in crucial moments to be willing to harness their power, their social capital, in the form of his ability to convince his family and his friends to put themselves to this effort, to go beyond where everyone else was going, to go deeper and going farther in anti-slavery activity, to push beyond the realm of the possible, because that was what risked their lives. And they were willing to do that. By willing to do it, they kickstarted the fucking engine of history. They melded the aims of the largely racist anti-slavery working class of the North, who hated slavery because it was economic competition, and the abolitionist middle class, which hated slavery on moral grounds. He helped weld them together, and that was the coalition that, together with the rebelling slaves in the South, defeated the slave power. He made it possible. And then the death of Lincoln, before he could maybe play that role in consecrating the new unity out of that. Wilkes Booth and Brown are the two guys who sacrificed themselves for something and were consequentially leverage points in human history, whose actions and sacrifices changed the flow of human history through sheer concentration of will in good and bad ways. And at the beginning, at the end of the Civil War era.
And it's to that point, I would like to read something that one of my favorite people in American history, Eugene Debs, wrote in the socialist newspaper Appeal to Reason in 1907 about John Brown and the need for the spirit of John Brown to return. And I want to say before that I read this, that when I say we need, like, John Brown as an example, as I've talked about, I do not mean any of the violence that it carried out, which is what people like. Let's be real. People like John Brown because he cut the heads off of slavers. And they think of John Brown and they imagine themselves like beheading a Proud Boy, and they feel like this violent fantasy that they have is virtuous. That's what it is. And I'm not talking about that. Like, I think anybody who's observed America knows that, like, any kind of exemplary violence is not going to motivate any sort of titanic conflict. It's only going to be absorbed as entertainment and as content the way that everything else is. So, I'm not talking about violence. I'm talking about a spirit of commitment. John Brown's violence was in the context of a strategy of ending of slavery, which was broadly correct, in that he saw that there was a standoff between sides in which no one on the North cared about slavery enough to commit enough to create a genuine point of conflict with the South. The South was pretty confident up until Bleeding Kansas that they would just eventually take over the government. They were on, because there was an asymmetry of interests. In the South, you had an entire an entire ruling class devoted to slavery at a fundamental level. A culture, wealth, everything was about slavery, and a white society that was all built around slavery, in the lowlands anyway. Surprisingly, in the hills where there weren't plantations, there was a lot less slavery, and weirdly, a lot less support for the Confederacy during the war. And for some reason, I don't know what it is. But in the North, like I said, it was largely, I just don't want slaves competing with me for labor. You had some abolitionists, those Whigs I was talking about, and people who were too hardcore for the Whigs, like the Liberty Party people and the Free Soilers, who said, no, fuck you, let's end this thing. But they were always considered annoying. Like, Northern Democrats hated abolitionists because they thought they were going to create a war that they didn't want to fight because they didn't care about slavery. But as the question of expansion became more central, and the investment of the South in expanding slavery and therefore expanding their control over government became more powerful, that changed the math in the North, but not enough to make anyone cross the fucking boundary. Because at the end of the day, it was abstract to people. It was not abstract to John Brown or the people who rode with him. It obviously wasn't abstract to black people either, but they had very limited power to influence white people's decision making. John Brown could go to Kansas and do violence that broke away from the stalemate, that galvanized the Free Soil factions in Kansas, who at that point had basically been backing down to the ruffians at every point, and made them fight. And the fight made everyone realize that what they were willing to do, and brought about the conflict. There's nothing like that in the current moment. There's no violence you could commit that would have that result. All violence would be absorbed. Fucking Stephen Paddock shot 70 fucking people to death from the top of a building, and it was the 5th biggest story of the month. There's no amount of violence you can do that will have any effect. Not even, it'll be negative effect. I'm not even going to say don't do it. I mean, yeah, if you kill people, that's bad probably. I mean, they probably didn't have it coming, especially if it's just because they have the wrong opinions about something. But my God, which is what it would really be. You're not going to go and fight real power. You're going to find somebody who said something you don't like on Twitter and shoot them or something like that, because that's what really matters to people. That's what they really care about. What I mean is that spirit of non-abstract commitment as a life. And like I have said, I am not that person. I mean, I would like to be, and maybe someday I will find a situation where I am like able to believe enough that the thing I could do in front of me would mean something, that would justify any sacrifice. But I think that spirit is necessary, and I think that it's going to be. I mean, I don't think it's not going to happen. I don't think it doesn't occur. I don't think it's not out there everywhere in the hearts of millions of people. It's a question of whether it'll spark in the right places and among the right people, where the rolling ball of humanity can like gather. And like I've said, when I talk about how atomized we are and how we are all consumers and how we can't even think politically, like that is a huge problem. Like Brown activated in an era where politicization of life was much more material. It was the spectacle of politics was much less a component of people's understanding of their politics. But if we're going to do anything, it's going to be. If we're going to do anything except like volunteer to be a 5th column when the fucking Chinese army shows up, that's what we have to keep our eyes out for, as I've said. Just keep aware. So we'll close here with this from the Appeal to Reason, November 23rd, 1907. The most picturesque character, the bravest man, and most self-sacrificing soul in American history was hanged at Charleston, Virginia, December 2nd, 1859. On that day, Thoreau said, "Some 1800 years ago Christ was crucified. This morning, perchance, Captain Brown was hung. These are the two ends of a chain which is not without its links. He is not Old Brown any longer. He is an angel of light. I foresee the time when the painter will paint that scene, no longer going to Rome for a subject. The poet will sing it, the historian record it, and with the landing of the Pilgrims and the Declaration of Independence, it will be the ornament of some future national gallery, when at least the present form of slavery shall be no more here. We shall then be at liberty to weep for Captain Brown." Few people dared on that fateful day to breathe a sympathetic word for the grizzled old agitator. For years he had carried on his warfare against chattel slavery. He had only a handful of fanatical followers to support him, but to his mind his duty was clear, and that was enough. He would fight it out to the end, and if need be, alone. Old John Brown set an example of moral courage and of single-hearted devotion to an ideal for all men and for all ages. With every drop of his honest blood he hated slavery, and in his early manhood he resolved to lay his life on freedom's altar in wiping out that insufferable affliction. He never faltered. So godlike was his unconquerable soul that he dared to face the world alone. How perfectly sublime. He did not reckon that overwhelming numbers against him, nor the paltry few that were on his side. This grosser aspect of the issue found no lodgment in his mind or heart. He was right, and Jehovah was with him. His was not to reckon consequences, but to strike the immortal blow, and to step from the gallows to the throne of God. Not for earthly glory did John Brown wage his holy warfare, not for any recognition or reward the people had it in their power to bestow. His great heart was set upon a higher goal, animated by a loftier ambition. His grand soul was illuminated by a sublimer ideal. A race of human beings, lowly and despised, were in chains, and this festering crime was eating out the heart of civilization. In the presence of this awful plague, logic was silent, reason dumb, pity dead. The wrath of retributive justice, long asleep, awakened at last and hurled its lurid bolt. Old John Brown struck the blow, and the storm broke. That hour, chattel slavery was dead. In the first frightful convulsion, the slave power seized the grand old liberator by the throat, put him in irons, and threw him into a dungeon to await execution. Alas, it was too late. His work was done. All Virginia could do was to furnish the crown for his martyrdom. Victor Hugo exclaimed in a burst of reverential passion, "John Brown is grander than George Washington." History may be searched in vain for an example of noble heroism and sublime self-sacrifice equal to that of old John Brown. From the beginning of his career to its close, he had but one ideal, and that was to destroy chattel slavery. And in that cause, he sealed his devotion with his noble blood. Realizing that his work was done, he passed serenely, almost with joy, from the scenes of man. His calmness upon the gallows was awe-inspiring, his exhalation supreme. Old John Brown is not dead. His soul still marches on, and each passing year weaves new garlands for his brow and adds fresh luster to his deathless glory. Who shall be the John Brown of wage slavery? I would just like to note also, John Brown was not a middle-class Whig. He was a broke stockman and farmer. He did not learn the wrongness of slavery in the parlors of good society. He learned it in his heart. And that's where everything has to come from. If it comes from a desire to be perceived as good, if it comes from a desire to justify one's social position and purge oneself of the guilt associated with the exploitation inherent in their position, it can go to no good.
Like, the thing is all the ideas we talk, all the words we say, like when we talk about religion and politics, when we talk about values, we talk about things like socialism or Christianity. These things only have meaning. These things have a symbolic meaning, and they have an emotional meaning. And the more socially attenuated your existence is, the less the meaning of like the symbols you use is grounded in an experiential communion with other people, the more they are merely symbolically or logically convincing. Which means that when you get into a conflict between resolving a question towards answering it, or resolving a question, and therefore having to maybe do something you don't want to do, and just keep having it because that's more fun, and it's filling up the same psychic slot in your head towards political action and political activism and political self-fulfillment, you're going to pick that. And that includes me. That's why I made a fucking podcast. Because it was easier and it was more fun. And it will always be more fun and easy to post. And the sacrifice has to come not from a logical proposition that you pose yourself. It has to come from a place of, dare I say it, love, where the love is transcendent of your individual sense of consciousness, where your ego has been reduced in your calculation of value. That's the John Brown spirit I'm talking about, where it was not the violence that he carried out that mattered, really. That was a tactic. What mattered was that he was willing to sacrifice himself with actual efficacy in a way that others weren't. I've said this before, but John Brown was the synthesis of the two strains of anti-slavery politics that emerged in the antebellum American North. You had abolitionism, middle-class phenomenon centered in cities like Boston, of doily, bored rich people who saw slavery as a moral horror, which boiled down to, because they're still participating in the system and they don't really challenge its ability it in any meaningful way, because they don't operate from any awareness that or desire to abolish class anyway. That boils down to impoliteness. It's a moral horror, but it's because it's gross. I'm not saying these people weren't good. I'm not saying that they didn't operate out of pure hearts, but like their pure hearts were wrapped around a definition of good, of morality, that was desacralized by the experience of being a middle-class urbanite. And it was replaced with this abhorrence in manners. Now in the South, in the butternut North, and in the urban tenements of the Irish, mostly Irish urban rabble, there was, and although less with them because they were clients of the Democratic Party, the non-Irish urban workers, the non-Catholics, the non-Tammanyized ones, who were, like, there were plenty of mechanics who were anti-slavery, who were free soil. And then, of course, almost the whole of the yeomanry across the whole northern tier were eventually, as the issue became more prominent, more committed to anti-slavery, because they saw it as a material threat to their way of life. A labor competition in which they were at a disadvantage, and which would lead them or their children to end up in a situation where they would, of course, have to either be master of slave, and being a smallholder with no capital, likely to become a fucking slave. And what this meant was that these two movements, they had different approaches to the question of opposing slavery. The abolitionists had a general theory of moral suasion. Like, that was the Garrisonian school. Proselytize the awfulness of slavery, and eventually people will realize how horrible it is because of the power of our oratory, and it will make them stop doing it. And of course they thought that, and they thought it deeply. But what was underneath even their understanding is that the real reason they thought that is because they didn't want to get their hands dirty. They lived nice lives. They did not feel precarious. They did not feel threatened by slavery. They did not feel the daily pain of alienation of being a fucking backbreaking yeoman trying to, like, pay off a mortgage to some fucking bank out east, or a toiling urban mechanic. They had real problems to worry about. So the abstract pain of somebody else wasn't any more real to them than it was to the northern abolitionists. And so their anti-slavery was basically just vote Whig, and then over time vote Republican. Like, vote for yourself. Just like, I don't, I'm not going to do that. But if there's a choice, more slavery, less slavery, I'm going to vote less slavery. Let me know what else happens. Then, of course, the South says, oh yeah, no, we're going to get rid of the Union. And they're like, oh, I guess we got to throw hands. And out of the war, anti-slavery sentiment became real because the bloodshed and the experience of it actually made it real. But before that, it wasn't there. What consecrated what catalyzed that opposition to slavery which was attenuated because it was divided in a way that the Southern pro-slavery aristocracy was completely undivided, was John Brown fusing the real pain. I mean, this guy was miserable. He made attempts at being a speculator, like a lot of people did in the Ohio River Valley, I believe, or the Western Reserve, and he speculated on land, but he was ruined by the 1836 panic. Thank you, Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Ruin, more like it. And he was broke the rest of his life. He was constantly hounded by debtors. Hounded by debtors. He was in court all the time. He went to fucking England on a cockamamie scheme to manipulate the wool market and ended up eating shit and owing everybody money. He was he was always on someone else's tenterhook. He was his closest thing. Even though he had his own property and he had farms that he worked, either gifted to him by Garrett Smith or owned outright before they were taken from him, he was working for other people, even in that capacity. And he was always tenuous. But and so he had the rough manner and the willingness to take questions to the extremity posed by his own suffering. He also lost 11 of his 20 children, I believe, in childhood. Or dying before him, including a number of them who were killed in his war against slavery, either with him at Harper's Ferry beforehand in Kansas. Fred, for example. It was like real human, like real experience consecrated his pain, and he expressed it towards an institution that was offensive to the human spirit at a level that only he really could sense, because of the wealth of the depth of his pain and his connection of that pain to the pain of others. That spiritualized understanding that the swells in Boston said they had mouthed, but for most part, at the end of the day, didn't really believe. Because remember, these guys weren't really Christians for the most part. They were Unitarians by this point. They were all like Emersonian transcendentalists. Their faith was weak tea. They did believe in the brotherhood of man, but they were ideas. As they are to us now. These were our predecessors. This is the favored class. This is the buffeted, costed, favored, middle strata class that's born up through the tides of history until now, at which point the thing is capsizing. But on the bedrock was their wanting to preserve their comfortable position. Brown had no comfortable position, so his moral horror at slavery and his religious horror at slavery was a live wire. It was grounded to a well of real pain that was connected to him and his family and the people he loved the most. And that drove him to break a stalemate that was always being settled on the side of slavery because the slavers wanted it more. They were on the precipice of winning the Kansas battle because they wanted it more. Because they had a unified working class that as a whole, and a social order that did away with any of the niceties surrounding this as an issue, either because there is no social opposition to it, at least wherever planter economies were hegemonic, they were hegemonic in the creation of the entire social order around them, and the alienation of the smallholder of the South, the white smallholder of the South, was as ideologically ensnared as it was in the North, just towards the planter position. And there was no real opposition. Southern unionism didn't even really cohere until very late in the sectional crisis, because it didn't seem like it was really going to happen until that point. And John Brown was the one Northerner who was willing to put the fucking bet down and say, I am willing to sacrifice this. This might not work. Because the reason the North kept backing down is because the only way to win was to risk. And why risk? Because nobody's really that concerned. Even the northern opposition to slavery in the non-middle class sphere was firming up. But you could also let things go. John Brown wasn't going to let anything go, and the violence all flowed from that. And you can question the tactical necessity of it, but you cannot question the morality. It's more moral than anything any of us have ever done. And I think even tactically, you got to say it worked. You know, they hang him in 1859. Within 2 years, the guy who sentenced him to hang was in a federal jail after having been taken off the CSS Trent, trying to go to negotiate with the British. The world can turn upside down, but you're not going to live to see it. Or in realistic terms, because we're not in that moment, we're not in that apocalyptic moment. We're at a basic level of like building even, you know, like the rudiments of a social consciousness to operate out of. So there's no need for that kind of thing. There does though need to be a willingness to sacrifice in terms of just letting go of some possibility for personal selfish pleasure, which is always going to be more real